All right. In the interest of time, we can get started. We'll just do some introductions as more people trickle in. We have a packed schedule, so hopefully we can get it all in within an hour. But thank you so much for joining our session today on reducing the environmental impact of concrete materials used by state departments of transportation. My name is Anish Chalak. I work at Rocky Mountain Institute on our Embodied Carbon Initiative, and we'll talk a little bit more about our team shortly. If you're not familiar with RMI, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization transforming the global energy system to create a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. We work in a number of different sectors. You can see at the bottom of this slide, electricity, buildings, transportation, industry. And this work on low carbon concrete really brings together a number of these different disciplines. We offer technical support and expertise to policymakers and agency staff to help them with this transition. So if you didn't already know, today we're going to be talking about embodied carbon. And we're going to just start, from the fundamentals. A lot of this is redundant information for you all, but when we talk about embodied carbon, we're referring to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. And today we're really going to focus on this upfront piece. So the data and the infrastructure that goes into upfront embodied carbon and measuring that from the extraction and manufacturing of building materials. So you were invited to this low carbon concrete workshop series, and I wanted to spend just a minute explaining to you all what that is. RMI will be hosting in collaboration with partners such as Carbon Leadership Forum and others, a series of workshops over the next 6 to 8 months, where we will unpack different topics relating to low carbon concrete. So we'll provide high-level information, foundational information, and then really try to dig into some of the ways to implement low carbon concrete projects at your agencies, and also unpack some of the emerging technologies that are coming into the market and finding ways that we can get those poured in place on transportation projects. So a pretty broad suite of topics that we hope to address as part of the series. And we hope to build a learning cohort. So this is the first workshop. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope you will continue to join us. And as we have follow-up conversations, we'll have more interactive sessions where we can actually get into a group and have a dialogue. This first session is presented more in a webinar context. And again, as we work towards the future, we're looking to align on some pathways to reduce the environmental impact of concrete in DOT projects and really set up some coordinated efforts to address key barriers, because our goal is to align agencies across the country so that each of you is not taking on this topic individually, and there's a collective body of knowledge that is developing. So today I'm joined by Jordan Parmeri from Carbon Leadership Forum and Haley Goodall from Colorado DOT, and they'll provide some great presentations on case studies, as well as some high-level framing up top. Getting into our agenda, we've gone through some introductions. Jordan will frame the opportunity. Why is this important? Why should we care about this? And then I'll speak a little bit about some introductory information about Buy Clean policy. Some of that might be redundant information to you all, but we really hope to bring everyone along as we build this learning group. So starting with fundamental information is really important. And then Jordan and Haley will get into some details about specific program case studies And then we'll, towards the end of the call, do some audience polling to hear from you about what you're interested in and what your priorities are before we wrap up. So with that, I will hand it off to Jordan to frame the opportunity.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, Anish. I'm going to just spend the next few minutes talking about what opportunity we have in front of us for using public procurement to lower the impacts of embodied carbon. In this chart, you'll see the embodied carbon of construction in the United States, and we can see from 2008 to 2018, about a 10-year period there, the spending of public dollars on construction contributed to about a third of all embodied carbon impacts within the United States. Half of that's on buildings, the other half is about on infrastructure. And that's a really big number, right? This is why we're focused so much on public procurement, is because public procurement of construction services and materials make up a third of all impacts in the United States. And so while these are really large impacts, they're also really large opportunities. It's an opportunity to lead by example for the public sector. It's an opportunity to spend public dollars with a low carbon future, with a low carbon vision in mind. And it's an opportunity to create demand for low carbon products and really give that signal to the industrial sector that there really is a market for low carbon products out there. So this is the big picture at a country scale in the US. And when we look at public procurement at the scale of a DOT, we see a pretty similar story in that the impacts of purchasing materials make up a large portion of a DOT's impact. If we go to the next slide, Anish. This is a study we did with the Washington State Department of Transportation, released it a few months ago. It's a greenhouse gas inventory of their operations. Many DOTs have done this, and we see pretty similar results across the country. And in this GHG inventory, we measured scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The emissions of purchasing construction services and materials are in the blue bar there, scope 3 emissions. And you can see over a 5-year period, those scope 3 emissions really did dominate the total emissions profile for the Washington State Department of Transportation. And we do greenhouse gas inventories to really identify where the impacts are and where we should focus our time and efforts to reduce those impacts. There are a lot of reduction opportunities. And in the next slide, Anish, we looked at a number of these opportunities to really chart a path of how to get Washington State WashDOT from where they are today to a near zero operational status. Many of these strategies focus on materials, asphalt, concrete, and steel, and some of them focus on things like transportation and the actual construction process itself. A lot of these strategies, and obviously I'm not going to go through these 36 different strategies right now, but a lot of these strategies are already being practiced by DOTs around the country and may not be fully utilized or fully implemented across a bunch of different projects. So I encourage you to check out the report if you want to learn more about the strategies. And overall, I think that the picture that I'm trying to paint here is that while, yes, there are a lot of impacts, there are also a ton of opportunities to reduce those impacts. And we'll cover a few of those today. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Anish.
Thanks, Jordan. So next, we're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of Buy Clean policy, which is an emerging policy in the US. Just a quick housekeeping note, if you have any questions as we're presenting, you can use the Q&A function, and at the end of the presentations, we will have a few minutes to answer those. So yeah, just use the Q&A function as we're going along. So what is Buy Clean? Buy Clean is a green public procurement policy that is developed to address carbon-intensive building materials used for building projects and also for infrastructure projects built by the government. The goal here is to leverage the large purchasing power of the government to catalyze industrial decarbonization. So Buy Clean focuses on carbon-intensive sectors such as concrete, cement, steel, asphalt, glass. It varies from region to region, but those are typically the materials that are addressed as part of Buy Clean policies. And a really important note here, going back to that life cycle diagram about embodied carbon that was presented up top, Buy Clean really focuses on upfront greenhouse gas emissions. So we're tracking and measuring data from the extraction and manufacture of materials, which is the A1 through A3 phase of a life cycle assessment. So the key basics about how the Buy Clean mechanism works are that there's a disclosure element, so requiring the disclosure of embodied carbon data for the covered products using an environmental product declaration. And then there are emissions limits that go alongside that requirement, which would set a maximum allowable embodied carbon limit for each of those material categories. And the intent is that those emissions limits are set so that they push the market to reduce emissions over time. So you could anticipate that the limits would become more stringent over time as the market develops new technologies to reduce emissions. So it's sort of a push and pull mechanism. And in terms of how this is typically rolled out, is there's a period when governments collect data. So this disclosure piece is really critical upfront to gather the critical data to set the emissions limits, and then emissions limits follow. So I know Haley will talk a little bit more about Colorado's process with doing just this for their Buy Clean policy. So, getting into the details of what the actual data mechanism is here, the EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration, is the key piece of information that is used for procurement as part of Buy Clean. And EPDs are independently verified documents that report environmental data for life cycle assessment in accordance with international standards. And there are a number of different environmental impact categories that are documented as part of an EPD. And you can see that in the graphic on the right. There's global warming potential, which is the one that we are focused on typically for Buy Clean policies, but there are also other impact categories relating to ozone depletion, acidification, et cetera, that are also documented and can be useful. Another piece of information about EPDs is that the rules for how they're developed are set by product category rules. So product category rules sort of set the framework for how the life cycle assessment is conducted to produce the EPDs. And different material categories will have different PCRs. The goal is that the general framework for data quality and things like that for PCRs is consistent across different material categories, but we acknowledge that there are unique aspects for each material that will define the details of that PCR. So there are different types of EPDs that are associated with different quality of data. So starting at the sort of most broad type of EPD, which is an industry-wide EPD. So an industry-wide EPD is providing a benchmark across a number of manufacturers. And this is typically developed by a trade association. For the concrete industry, NRMCA, the National Ready Mix Association, is the administrator of the industry-wide EPD, and they provide benchmarks across different regions for concrete materials. And these industry-wide EPDs are useful to set high-level benchmarks for concrete materials, but we don't recommend that they're actually used to make procurement decisions as part of Buy Clean policies. which is where product-specific EPDs come in. So product-specific EPDs, detail the impacts for a specific product from a single manufacturer. One nuance is that product-specific EPDs may document products coming from multiple facilities, but these are produced by single manufacturers, which make them a much more robust and accurate form of data. But the highest standard or most detailed EPD would be a facility-specific EPD. And this is what we recommend be used for Buy Clean policy implementation or pilot implementation for low carbon concrete. And this documents not only a single manufacturer, but also a single manufacturing facility. And when the data is provided at that resolution, it can really enable you to make comparisons across functionally equivalent products. Some nuances about concrete materials and some of the barriers that it poses as part of Buy Clean. The concrete industry has a complex supply chain. There's regional variation. There's a number of local suppliers for this material, unlike some of the other materials that are covered in Buy Clean typically. Another barrier that we're seeing is that supplementary cementitious materials, which are replacing cement, are having reduced availability these days, which is posing a concern for how you can reduce the emissions impact. There are always cost considerations, and finally, just general awareness and education amongst the industry players about what all of this means. Again, because concrete is a regional material, we're speaking to small businesses who may not have the capacity to on their own just know about all this information. Another nuance about Buy Clean relating to how concrete materials are specified. The EPDs have sort of come out of the building industry and the building sector. And in the building sector, strength classes have been used as a way to organize categories for evaluating emissions. So you can see on the left different strength categories, and on the right is really how DOTs think about it. DOTs are thinking about things more in terms of use classes. And so there are some nuances to how a Department of Transportation would implement a Buy Clean policy in contrast to the building industry. And these are some of the topics that we hope to unpack as part of this workshop series. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a few opportunities from the federal government that are coming through. One is the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides $2 billion in funding for federally funded highway projects. So these are incentives to procure low carbon materials. In addition, there is a climate challenge program, a grant program by FHWA, which I know many of you are participating in, which will help set up and already is helping set up EPD programs in different states. There's also $6.3 billion in supply side investment in the Inflation Reduction Act, and this will support industrial decarbonization projects for cement and concrete facilities. So we can anticipate that there will be deeply decarbonized products coming onto the market. And a question to pose to this group is, will DOTs be ready and able to purchase these materials? And so we hope to unlock some of that opportunity as part of this workshop series. With that, I'm going to hand it to Haley to walk through some details about Colorado's experience with Buy Clean.
Awesome, thank you, Anish. Hello, everyone. My name is Haley Goodell. I'm a pavement design engineer for the Colorado DOT. I'm also on the EPD implementation team. I'm super excited to talk about kind of how we stood up our program and some of the lessons we've learned so far. And I have a lot to cover, so let's get into it. The House Bill 2113-03, or Buy Clean Colorado, was passed in July of 2021. It revises the Colorado Revised Statutes with 2 sections. The first section is related to vertical construction and is directed towards the Office of the State Architect. And section 118 refers to CDOT and horizontal construction. So that's going to be my focus today. But section 118 requires CDOT to begin collecting environmental product declarations on 5 broad material categories: asphalt and asphalt mixtures, cement and concrete mixtures, and steel. And then the overall intent of our program is to reduce GHG emissions over time. Next slide, please. The key timelines included in the CDOT portion of the bill are shown here. As of July 1st of last year, we began collecting EPDs for eligible projects on eligible materials. And we're going to use the information we collect between now and January 1st of 2025, when we have to establish a policy setting maximum global warming potential limits for those materials. The law does allow us to establish subcategories, which I'll get into later. Then starting July 1st of 2025, the winning contractor will be required to submit EPDs that are in compliance with our policy. Starting in 2026, we will begin reporting to legislature, and then in 2027 and every 4 years thereafter, we will review and possibly adjust our policy. But there is a catch. We cannot make the policy less stringent for any material once those limits are set. Next slide, please. So how did we stand up our program? It was an unfunded mandate. So first we applied for some funds through a transportation pooled fund study, as well as through CDOT's research group. And once we secured some funding, we set up a team that consists of CDOT staff, consultant staff, a subject matter expert, the FHWA Colorado Division Office, and academia. Next slide, please. We know that implementation of a program like this is going to be a challenge for not only us, but also our suppliers and contractors. So we wanted to see if we could establish some way to not get so lost in the weeds that we lose sight of the big picture. So we performed extensive analysis to determine small quantity thresholds and project cost limits under which EPDs are not required. For the small quantity limits, they range between $25,000 and $50,000 of material costs. And then for the project cost threshold, we determined $3 million would still cover over 90% of those eligible materials. And we do think that that limit can be reduced over time as our program matures. If you want more information on the getting into the weeds of how we developed these limits, we have a white paper on our webpage that goes into a lot more detail. Next slide, please. CDOT's EPD spec and protocol document were published July 1st of 2022. The spec is pretty bare bones. It's basically just an instruction to the contractor to refer to our protocol document, which is housed in our field materials manual. And that document goes into a lot more detail, such as submittal timing, specific bid items requiring EPDs, and small quantity limits. Next slide, please. So based on an evaluation of industry readiness in our first year, we decided to target our EPD collection on those materials that were ready to go. And those were ready mixed concrete, asphalt, and reinforcing steel. And over the past year, we have been educating other industries and kind of bringing them up to speed. And we will be requiring EPDs for precast and pre-stressed concrete structures, as well as structural steel this July. And speaking of education, one of our biggest focuses to date has been industry outreach. We've hosted multiple workshops, feedback sessions, et cetera, with all of the affected industries and really all of our stakeholders. So that included CDOT staff, other agencies such as FHWA, the material suppliers, the contractors. We allowed all of these groups to review and provide feedback on our spec and protocol document before publication. This was not only because we wanted it to feel like a collaborative effort, because it is, but we also didn't want to implement anything that wasn't practical. And then we're also actively involved in multiple PCR committees to improve the current status of EPDs and PCRs. So for concrete specifically, we realized that there was no guidance in the concrete PCR to develop an EPD for mobile batch plants. So we worked with the program operator to develop language and publish an addendum that contains that guidance. A few more specifics. We are requesting EPDs be submitted 2 weeks prior to material placement, and we are strongly requesting facility and supply chain specific data, like Anish was talking about. Next slide, please. As of last month, over 60 projects have been advertised that contain the EPD spec, and we've received 40 EPDs so far, but we're expecting more soon as construction season continues. Next slide, please. So along with industry outreach, we've developed training and resources which are hosted on our EPD webpage. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into these, but if you just Google c.epd, you should be able to find them. And now the fun slide, challenges and lessons learned. I know this is a lot of information to take in, but I just want to share some of the things to consider if either you are currently impacted or will be impacted by a buy clean policy. So first of all, performance-based specs have been really helpful in implementing a program like this. That we have been pretty proactive as well as industry in replacing prescriptive specifications. So for example, we've allowed Portland limestone cement since the early 2000s, 2008. We allow up to 50% cement replacement of fly ash and slag, and we don't have any minimum cement contents. And these spec changes were made for performance and durability, but they also substantially enhance the sustainability of concrete. Second, we have learned that there are some communication gaps. So although we've tried really hard to reach everyone, some people aren't members of their trade organizations, so that's been difficult. And we've also had some supplier hesitance to provide their EPDs, especially when they might be higher than the industry average. We've really tried to communicate that the more accurate data we get, the better our limits will be. And we don't want to exclude a portion of the market just because they are hesitant to supply their data. Third, we recognize that there is a potential burden on smaller suppliers. We haven't encountered it yet, but we anticipate we will. Timing also presents a challenge, especially when it comes to concrete. Sometimes the supplier might not know where their mobile batch plant will be until right before construction begins. Like most government agencies, we also have limited personnel to perform verification and quality assurance activities. We've also learned that a robust database is essential to a program like this, and we're kind of working through challenges with that right now. Verification and accuracy. Sorry, I'm really rapid firing, but please reach out if you have questions. Verification and accuracy. So concrete EPDs currently don't report quantities or percentages of mixed constituents. So how can we verify that the EPD provided represents the material that's being placed in the field? In addition, many EPDs utilize industry average values for cement, and this can drastically skew GWP values, in turn skewing our limits. Lastly, there are many unknowns. We don't know how our EPD requirements will impact material costs, how improvements to data sets or tools will impact key EPD metrics, or just how the state of the practice will go. And then, as Anish said, harmonization between policies is super important so that suppliers don't have to follow a bunch of different sets of rules. And then there's a concern that we might not collect enough data before our policy must be established in 2025. Next slide, please. So in an effort to resolve some of these challenges, we applied for and were granted funding through the Climate Challenge, which we'll use for 3 projects. The first is just continued support of our program. The second will be our benchmarking and limit setting, as well as our subcategories setting. So we want to use as much representative material data submitted to us as possible, but we understand that there are also lots of nationally recognized databases that we might use. In terms of subcategories, strength is a great place to start, but there are a bunch of other factors that can impact GWP, and so we're really trying to be aware of that, and we're going to do a deep dive on that. And then for our third project, we'll be gaining familiarity with the life cycle thinking and the LCA PAPE tool. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for your time. Please reach out if you have any questions.
Great. Thanks, Haley. That was great. Really impressive work happening in Colorado, especially since you're dealing with so many materials all at once. Hello again, everybody. Today, for the second case study, I'm going to present the City of Portland's low carbon concrete program. You're going to see a number of similarities to some of the things that Haley just presented. I'm going to talk about the GWP limits that were set and the process they took to set those limits. I do want to stress that obviously we're talking about a city program here that's focused on more than just the DOT, right? It's focused on their water bureau, their parks bureau, everybody who purchases concrete at the City of Portland. This was the first public procurement policy in the United States to require concrete EPDs and set GWP limits. Although it is not a state DOT, I do think it serves still as a good example because there's a lot of different ways to do this. And we're just presenting two examples today to help add to the sort of general body of knowledge here. So with that, City of Portland's policy was passed in May of 2019. Shortly thereafter, they started requiring concrete EPDs for all projects that were purchasing over 50 cubic yards of concrete. Again, sort of referring back to these small quantity thresholds that Haley was talking about. So they didn't matter what the EPD said, just give me your EPD. Starting in January of 2020, they then formed an advisory committee, started collecting data and running pilot projects to help inform where to set the maximum GWP limits for their purchase of concrete. I was honored to be a member of the advisory committee, which is part of the reason why I'm presenting this information to you today. The City of Portland published their GWP limits in mid-2022. And they started enforcing them in January of this year. So they have enforced limits for about the last 6 months in the City of Portland. Over the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about where the city ended and then backtrack a little and talk about how they got there. Next slide, please. Right away, the city put the EPD requirements directly into construction specifications. They said what types of projects need to submit EPDs, what kind of EPD we want, and where to submit them. They did not put the final GWP limits into standard specs because they envisioned that those limits would be reviewed and or updated more frequently than they update their standard construction specs. So something to consider out there for other DOTs. Next slide, please. The city also has an approved concrete mix design list. I know not every DOT has one of these, but if you do have one of these, it really does make implementation, compliance, enforcement, it can make it a lot smoother, right? You submit your mix, you get screened once. Once you're on the list, contractors can pick and choose any mix and it automatically meets their policy. So this is another good implementation strategy. Next slide, please. Here are the City of Portland's concrete GWP limits that have now been in effect for about 6 months. They are divided up by strength class. They apply to commercial grade concrete, structural concrete, pavement. We have a few limits for lightweight concrete and one for controlled low strength material. On the advisory committee, we discussed limits for shotcrete quite a bit. A little bit, we discussed drilled shaft and grout. For shotcrete, there was just too much variability in project type, application, the actual applicator. To really set limits first round on shotcrete, there's just too much variability. And there's also just really low volumes of all three of those materials being consumed by the city as a whole. So just passed on those first round for setting GWP limits. The other thing I'll note about the city's policy that is unique, and I hope other policies follow, is that they did use a project budgeting approach, which basically says, you have one budget for the entire project. And if you use concrete that's higher than one of the limits in one part of the project, you can basically make up for that high carbon concrete through another portion of the project by using extra low carbon concrete there. So that overall the project averages out to be the total project budget. This is kind of a win-win for everybody. You're still meeting your policy goals while giving the contractor and the concrete producer more flexibility to meet those goals. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to kind of go in reverse here and look at how these GWP limits were set. Next slide, please. There was a stakeholder advisory committee, about 20 different folks on it. City bureaus, concrete producers, engineers, contractors, architects, and subject matter experts. You can look at the city's website. They have a lot of details on there about the goals of the committee, how they set it up, a lot of justifications for what issues they faced and how they resolved them. So I encourage you to check that out. Next slide, please. The general approach here, and this is really my characterization of the general approach, is we as an advisory committee looked at what's being consumed and what's being produced. What's being consumed is basically a look back at the last couple of years of projects to say, what's the city of Portland buying right now, right? And that establishes a baseline against which you can make other comparisons. And then we looked at what's being produced, right? Like what's on the market, and how much are we going to be able to reduce the impacts of our purchases based on what's available and what's feasible. Next slide, please. When we looked at what is being produced, which is what I'll start with, this slide shows the available EPDs in the Portland metro area. This is one of the first things we looked at. We made a request from the EC3 tool, got a custom download, and basically plotted EPDs by strength class and global warming potential. And the green dotted line here, which is going to be present on the next couple of slides, are the NRMCA regional benchmarks for the Pacific Northwest. This is a great starting place to just have a point of comparison that's consistent across your data collection efforts. And in this case, one of the first things that pointed out to us was that only 25% of the EPDs available on the market in most of these strength classes were actually at or below NRMCA's regional benchmark. The city of Portland actually ended up setting their GWP limits right at these regional benchmarks at the end. They didn't know that in the beginning, but the first sort of red flag that went up is that, well, if the limit is set right at that green line, we're going to be excluding 75% of the available mixes on the market to comply with the policy. So is that okay? What does that mean? Are we going to be able to meet our project goals? Is it feasible? So that was the first flag to go up to say, we need to be doing more pilot projects to figure this out. Next slide, please. This is a slide around the city's consumption of concrete in 3 different streams of projects. The gray bars are sidewalks and curbs. The little dots are maintenance projects. And then the big circles below the line there are water bureau projects, mainly reservoirs and wastewater treatment plants. I don't have a lot of time. So the moral of the story here is that there are 3 different streams of projects. They were kind of all over the map as far as global warming potential. But it also gave us an opportunity to figure out what types of projects we need to look at for pilot projects and feasibility. Some of these projects were already below that green line, which again is where the city ended up setting their limits. Some of the projects were well above the line. And so we had to sort of strike a balance on the advisory committee about where to recommend limits so that they were feasible and achievable, at least within the first phase of the policy. Ultimately, where the limits were set, recognized about anywhere between a 10 and 30% reduction in carbon for at least 2 streams of projects running through the city. I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. Pilot projects. Just a few more slides left here on pilot projects. It's really important to do pilot projects, I think, because we all know concrete's a field cured product. There are different ways that lower carbon mixes sometimes cure and are finished, and it's important to engage the entire chain of folks involved, including the engineer, the contractor, the actual concrete producer, and then of course the finishers, all really important folks within the supply chain here. Next slide. The first pilot project we did was on sidewalk ramps. Basically, this was a blind pilot project where we didn't tell the finishers what type of mix was being poured. We interviewed them about the performance of those different mixes. We poured 100% cement mixes on one corner and poured a 50% slag mix on the next corner and interviewed them and measured the performance of the mixes. Overall, the low carbon mixes met the city's performance specs. They were really well received by the concrete finishers. They were cost neutral or less expensive, and they've been performing really well in the post-project inspections, all while reducing the carbon footprint on these projects between 25 and 35%. If you go to the next slide, this is my last one. The city went on to perform a number of different pilot projects in all of these different types of infrastructure settings. Really commend the city in involving a diversity of different types of projects and applications, a diversity of different concrete producers and concrete contractors and finishers. Really, not only were these pilot projects, but they were training exercises. They were exposing different folks around the city who typically do this work to these mixes. Overall, these were really successful projects. Basically, what we found compared to business as usual in these projects is that 25% carbon reduction was very achievable with little to no change in project schedule or finishing requirements. However, when we bumped up to about a 40% carbon reduction, typically these were 50% replacement mixes, we did encounter some schedule delays, some finishing challenges, and some of the flat work, especially in cold weather. So these were really informative to help the city figure out where to set limits. I am going to stop here because I think I'm a couple of minutes over. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Haley. I think we only have a couple of questions in the Q&A. They're both for Haley. One is, how are you dealing with small ready-mix producers who don't have EPDs? And the other one is, how are you considering costs? For Haley.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, Bill. So in terms of small ready-mix suppliers, we don't currently have any incentive or waiver program in place. We understand that this will come up and we're going to handle it on a project by project basis. We're handling all of the pre-bid, pre-construction, and pre-pave meetings so that we can kind of get everybody on the same page and make sure the suppliers hopefully will have EPDs. And then for costs, we anticipate that costs will go up based on these mandates. There's not much we can do. We do think that as time goes on and more people have EPDs ready to provide, then those cost increases will be less.
Thanks, Haley. There's one for you, Jordan, on the City of Portland pilot. Was it 20% reductions in GWP that were typically no cost schedule impact, or 30%? Folks are just curious about the no cost strategy.
There were a number of different, all of these pilot projects are published on the city's website, so I encourage you to check them out directly. On average, I think it was about 25% reductions caused no cost or schedule implications. And when I say compared to business as usual, most of these projects were used to using 100% cement mixes with zero SCM replacement. So that is business as usual, and that's the point of comparison that I'm using.
Thanks, Jordan. And yeah, it really emphasizes the importance of pilot projects, especially in the absence of mandates. Haley in Colorado are really jumping off the deep end, implementing a large scale policy. But there's things that DOTs who don't have mandates can do, and the Portland example is a really good one of piloting with the pours that you're doing.
No, I'll add real quick. Sorry. I do think it's super important pilot projects because you can kind of dip your toes in without having to jump right in. If a buy clean policy is implemented soon or in a few years, you'll know what you're doing.
Awesome. Well, for the next few minutes, I thought we could, turn the tables and hear from you, the audience, about what some of your priorities are. So we have a series of poll questions. So I'm going to pull up these slides, and at the top of the slide, you will see a mentee.com link. So if you can, on your computer, or it can be on your phone as well, just type in that link, mentee.com, and then this is our code. And I will try and click, maybe not. hopefully you guys can all join. I'll give it just a minute for folks to get on the Menti. And our first question is a simple one. It's, what is your current role working with state DOTs? Curious who's in the audience, just so folks get a sense of who's out there. And if you have any problems with getting into this menti.com survey, just ask in the chat, and we'll try and help you out. But just a minute or two just to get folks to answer this first question. And we have a number of other questions. So I'm seeing responses coming in. Great, a lot of materials engineers, contractors, consultants. Okay, policy office staff. Great. I see 71 of you participants and only 23 responses. So if you would like to participate, now is your chance. We have some fun questions coming up. All right, I'm seeing the responses plateauing. So we'll move forward with the next question. But again, just feel free to join. And as you join, what will happen is I'm gonna go forward into the next couple of questions, but if the question that I'm sharing on the screen looks different from what's on your prompt, there should be a prompt for you to align with what I'm presenting. Here we go, 30 people, great. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we're thinking about what folks are working on. Broad question, does your agency currently have a program or even a pilot to collect EPDs for concrete materials? No. Great. Well, we're here to help you, help the no's become yeses. And I'm sure the folks on the yes side are learning a lot of great things and would be interested in sharing that with the folks who are interested but don't currently have a program in place. So this is actually really interesting to see, and we hope that this learning cohort, as folks continue to stay engaged, can help with this imbalance. All right, next question. This one's a little bit more detailed, but we're curious about what some of the barriers that you are seeing. This would, I think, apply more to the folks who are currently piloting this, but what are some barriers specific to concrete materials? And I'll walk through them, lack of staff knowledge, availability of EPDs, lack of interest, perception that it'll cost more, and the last one is perception that the agency is already achieving low carbon mixes just through using SCM. So we have heard that come up a couple of times. Okay. Interesting. And if you're someone who has said other, it would be interesting. There's not a fill in the blank feature on Menti, but if you want to put in the chat what you're thinking with the other, that would be helpful just for us to understand. Great. So it seems like lack of staff knowledge is a key barrier. And again, that's the purpose of educational sessions like this. And we also know of a number of programs by FHWA to address the same problem. So building capacity is a key goal in the near term. All right, let's go to the next question. Which of the following opportunities to pilot low carbon concrete materials are resonating for you? The first one is collecting EPDs for upcoming projects that will be funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So those are opportunities for pilots at a large scale. Preferential procurement for lowest carbon bidders using EPDs. So this would be just asking for folks to provide EPDs, and you would offer preferential procurement for ones that have the lowest GWP. So rather than setting a limit, you're just sort of creating a competition. Demonstration pours, just trying stuff out. And then Haley spoke about specifications, but really transitioning from prescriptive to performance specifications. Seen a lot of interest for a number of these. Great, a lot of interest in this topic of specifications. It seems like a key barrier. Just a couple more minutes or seconds just for last few responses. Anyone else? All right. Just have a couple more of these. So looking into specific use cases, thinking about which types of use cases would be most ripe for piloting technologies or adjusting specifications. So based on your project work with ones of these seem like some opportunities. If you have something else in mind on the other section, again, if you want to drop that in the chat, that would be helpful. All right. I'm going to move forward in the interest of time. We just have a couple more. So thinking about new innovative concrete technologies, what is a first step to fast tracking these? So an example would be, we have been working a lot on LC3, which is an alternative cement product. And we're talking about demonstration projects here. So what's a way to fast track and demonstrate these projects? And this is a fill in the blank question. You can just type in an idea, if it's just piloting it on a sidewalk pour or a median or a curb or something like that. Feel free to put in an idea here. Incentives for small scale projects, low risk applications, specs coming up a lot. Great. I think I'll move forward to our last question, which is just an open question for the group. What is one topic relating to low carbon concrete that you would like to learn more about? As I mentioned, we're programming subsequent sessions and are curious to hear what topics you would like to hear about. So if you have any things that are top of mind, I'm already seeing a lot of interest in specifications, maybe more on pilots. Manufacturers, specifications, structural applications. Great. Any last inputs? I'll pause here for a minute. I know these fill in the blank questions can be challenging. Strategies for carbon capture from concrete demonstrations, net negative concrete, more research results for different concrete mixes, applications, incentive mechanisms. Great, these are all really good ideas, and we'll take those into consideration as we think about some future sessions. So with that, I'm just going to go back to the slides to close this out in a few more minutes. But we did want to provide some actionable next steps for folks. The first one, we've already said it. Try to develop a pilot for low carbon concrete procurement guidelines. So whether you have a mandate or not, testing this out on a procurement project would be a great place to start. And a basic place to start would be requesting facility-specific EPDs for concrete mixes. A little bit more advanced would be that idea about preferential bid evaluation. So sort of saying you're competing on costs, but you're potentially also competing on your reported GWP. And then there are some interesting examples on the results from preferential bids like that, which we can share as a follow-up. Another one is coordinating across your agency on what the pilot project pipeline is and identifying some robust high impact opportunities for collecting EPDs and using those as benchmarks. So Haley mentioned that collecting EPDs so that you can benchmark what GWP you're really getting for your different use cases, thinking about pilot projects that have different applications of different use classes of concrete, and so an opportunity for you to collect a larger body of information. And then, finally, just thinking about opportunities for how you can apply some of the emerging low carbon technology demonstrations. And then third, start thinking about prescriptive specifications and how they're creating barriers for procuring low carbon concrete mixes. So Haley had mentioned Colorado as an example of an agency that moved towards performance-based specifications many years ago for different reasons. But if your agency is not aligned with that, thinking about what you need to do to address that so that you can more easily implement this. And I'll just briefly hand it to Jordan to talk about the Washington State's Climate Challenge project, which is a good example of sort of road mapping this and putting it into practice.
Thanks, Anish. The map on the last slide, there's 25 different states working on climate challenge projects by FHWA. FHWA is doing a fantastic job with administering these grants and coordinating effort all around quantifying environmental impacts of pavement using life cycle assessment and EPDs. So it's a real big kickstart for the whole country for all 25 states to be working on this collectively. One project that we're working on, again, just to kind of give you a taste of what's happening, is we're coordinating with WSDOT right now, Washington State Department of Transportation, for their Climate Challenge grant. We are doing basically a mirrored project with Minnesota DOT, and this project involves collecting EPDs on 5 to 6 different pilot projects, all pavements, mostly asphalt, a couple concrete, and collecting EPDs and doing full pavement LCAs on all of those roadway projects. It includes training of the WSDOT staff in the beginning. It includes training of WSDOT staff and industry at the end of the project as well, based on some of the findings. Finally, the goal of the project is to help develop recommendations for WSDOT to adopt a concrete, not just a concrete, an EPD program for the materials that they purchase. So lots of different states are going through this, and really great opportunity to either participate or follow in someone else's efforts to kickstart your own efforts at your DOT.
Thanks, Jordan. And just a quick shout out as we wrap up for FHWA's education program. There is the Everyday Counts EPD Innovation opportunity. So check out FHWA's website to see what their workshops are, and we're staying coordinated with them to provide the most value for you all. So look forward to our next session. We're planning these to be every other month, so our next one will be in August. And we're open to providing one-on-one consultations if you're interested, and we can offer some technical support. So please reach out, and thank you so much for attending, and a special thank you to Jordan and Haley for presenting at this. So appreciate you all, and again, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody. All right, see y'all.